Welcome to Ignatian Pathways, a podcast from OIS gathering voices from the Ignatian family and sharing the many, many ways to God we have discovered through Ignatian Spirituality. As always, I'm Dr. Dave De La Fuente, Associate Director for Ignatian Young Adult Ministries. We still have 3 more of these episodes recorded back in November from the Ignatian Solidarity Network's Ignatian Family Teach-in for Justice in Washington, D.C. Today's guests are Dr. Jeannine Fletcher, Professor of Theology, Fordham University, Kaija DeWitt-Allen, Director of Campus Ministry, Xavier High School, and Shawna Gallagher Vera, Vice President of Communications and Marketing, Xavier High School. Great bunch of folks here, and I'll give you an opportunity to introduce yourselves, say a little bit about what you do and what's brought you here to the Ignatian Family Teach-in, whether it's the first time or the umpteenth time. Can we start with you, Shawna?
Sure. I'm Shawna Gallagher Vega. I'm the Vice President for Communications and Marketing at Xavier High School. I've been at Xavier for 11 years, but this is my first teach-in. I'm very excited to be here. And Xavier has been wonderful in giving a lot of opportunities to kind of pursue that deepening of Ignatian spirituality, which started for me in earnest at Boston College. So it's been a great weekend so far.
Yeah. We'll go around the horn to Jeannine Fletcher.
Sure. Jeannine Fletcher. I am a professor of theology from Fordham University. This is my 4th Ignatian Family Teach-in. A number of years ago, I worked with a group from our Dorothy Day Center for Service and Justice doing some anti-racism work. And then over the last 3 years, I have been running a workshop on a breakout session on how we use our institutional histories to recognize our part in the structures and systems of white supremacy in order to leverage those institutional histories for anti-racism work. So it's always a great opportunity to be at IFTJ and just to get the energy of folks doing some of this work for justice, but also to make the connections across the institutions.
Absolutely. And it is a family for sure. And more on that in a second. Kaija.
Sure. My name is Kaija DeWitt-Allen. I'm the Director of Campus Ministry at Xavier High School in New York City, and I also teach in the religion department. I teach social justice and world religions. This is probably, I think, maybe 12th or 13th teach-in. My first time was actually down in Fort Benning, Georgia, a very long time ago. And since I've been at Xavier, I've been 22 years in Jesuit secondary education. And I think we probably started about 10 years ago bringing students down to DC. So it's, I think for me, kind of just always part of my fall, being able to invite students and to be present and to be reinvigorated by the spirit of what happens here.
Yeah, I'm sure. I think history is definitely going to be a theme of this particular podcast episode. So I just met Shawna, but we did the Contemplative Leaders in Action program. Just missed each other by a year, but CLA NYC, so we have that history. And Kaija was my regional director for the New York City cohort. Was Kaija yours too? Or
Yeah, she was for the first year.
Yeah, and Jeannine was faculty, teaching mentor, faculty advisor and mentor to the Dorothy Day Center, and was one of the examiners of my dissertation. And I survived. So lots of great histories. I think that is part of this Ignatian family overall, and certainly part of this teaching. We'll dive into that in a second. But let's start off with kind of a fun, general, straightforward, I suppose, in a sense, invitation and prompt. We all have all these histories that are tied with the Jesuits and the broader Ignatian family in so many ways. What's one gift or a grace that you've received from this? And it could be, a specific memory. It could be like a disposition. Whatever comes to mind is great.
I'll hop in because it comes so clearly to me. This is Jeannine, and I went to a Jesuit high school, St. Ignatius, Chicago, and I can remember there being really instilled with this sense of a faith that does justice. And so it ends up feeling like a tagline, but it actually is true that this experience of connecting my work as a high school student with the broader work of justice, that really ended up carrying through my graduate, my college education, heading into the Jesuit Volunteer Corps, my graduate education. And so the gift of a community that continues to foster a faith that does justice.
Love it. Absolutely.
This is Kaija. I think because my job in its entirety feels like Ignatian spirituality and the life of St. Ignatius, it's hard to think about, where are the parts that just sort of, I feel like I kind of swim in the grace all the time of what happens. But a particular experience was it took me a very long time after being in Jesuit education to actually dive into doing the spiritual exercises. And I had the opportunity to spend 6 months in Spain doing an intensive study of St. Ignatius and the Society of Jesus. And we did our 8-day silent retreat of the exercises. And it was my first time. And I was the only person who had never done them before. And I was with a bunch of religious sisters and Jesuit superiors from all over the world. And I was a rookie, and I was so nervous that I was going to screw it up. And after my first, couple of days in silence, was meeting with my spiritual director, Father Joaquin, and I sat down and I was, just sort of blurting out my experience of prayer. And I sat back just waiting, like, okay, now, he's going to give me direction. And he said, go. And I said, what do you mean? And he was like, it's good. What's happening is good. I'm not going to get in your way, and go. And for me, that was just sort of this wash of, it's not as hard as I made it or made myself think that it was going to be. And so that the grace was really just sort of giving yourself that freedom to be able to try it, and so that for me is absolutely a pinpoint moment for where it felt like a great mystery to where it didn't seem like it was all that complicated.
Yeah, love it.
I think for me, there have been so many gifts, graces, but the one that has been constant throughout my time in Jesuit education and has really been reinforced recently. I just did a 7-day retreat in Gloucester, Massachusetts, at Gonzaga Eastern Point Retreat House, which I highly recommend. And what kept coming back up for me was that real gift of being able to find God in all things, and moments of joy. Certainly for me, I find God in nature a lot, which was a real treat to be in Gloucester among such beautiful nature, but also to be able to find God in difficult moments, which we all face. And, I had this really beautiful moment on retreat, which I shared with my spiritual director, Lisa Hastings, which was having this moment of remembering so many times when people showed the face of God to me in difficult moments, and having that reinforced to me also as an obligation to show the face of God to others, which I think is something that we're hearing so much and so powerfully from adults and young people this weekend, is how can we, even in small acts, show the face of God and help others find God in all things.
I love it. Thank you all for sharing. And it's often those small things that make a big difference. And as you were sharing, it's very clear that it's a long history, continues to unfold and develop and grow. And it made me think about the ways that I'm seeing glimpses of that in the folks who are here. So alongside these podcast episodes that we're doing on the side, so to speak, we've got a table for the Office of Ignatian Spirituality with 2 of our 4 retreat directors of the 4 houses of the East Province, including who I just met in person for the first time. My brain's fried at the moment. Siobhan Lowe. And so we've been talking with folks and inviting them, and I have a little camera set up, and I'm inviting folks to come by and share, how do you press on? How does spirituality help you press on? And there was a squad of Brophy high schoolers, and they were talking about the examen and how deeply it's making a difference for them. And it's like they're giving better answers than that I've gotten from that I would have given at that age and even at this age. And it's like, okay, so that history is just going to keep unfolding. And so we love that. I also heard there's a sense that there's an invitation that it's not that hard. God meets us, but that it also helps us meet the challenging personally, but also societally, institutionally. So this gives us an opportunity to unpack some of that a little bit. And And I have fresh in my memory, well, the word memory, but last night, the vigil prayer for the martyrs. Why is memory important for you in light, related to that particular prayer, but also in terms of being employees, members, collaborators in the Ignatian project, so to speak? Yeah. Any answer's fine, of course.
I think for me, when I think about memory and the role of memory, not only here, right? Because I think for so many of our students, 1989 and just seems like a lifetime ago. And to being able to see faces of martyrs and to be able to pray with them and for them and be present to them is kind of dipping back into that well of goodness. And I think about too, what I say to my students when we're on retreat, especially the older students, is, write while you're on retreat, because I had a retreat director a million years ago who said, you never exhaust the experience in the experience itself. And so when you write about that, those memories become fodder for your prayer and to be able to kind of touch back into those experiences later on. And so I see this opportunity for us to remember the martyrs in El Salvador really as a space for us to kind of remember those touch points where God was most deeply present for us. But 12 years later to think back, like what hotel were we in and what, kind of what we were doing, but those were all grace spaces to use memory really to remember where that grace had been.
Great. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm actually a former history teacher many moons ago, and I always remember that history being so powerful for students when they could put a face to it, when they realized these are not just names that were in a book, these were lives that were lived. So as my first teach-in, I found that very powerful last night to see not just the martyrs of El Salvador, but so many names and faces, and to hear their names read aloud. I think that was very powerful for our young men at Xavier High School and for the thousands of people who are here.
The teach-in has given me an opportunity to share a little bit more of my work on memory in a slightly different register, in aligned with some of the work that's been going on at Georgetown and the memory and the reconciliation projects, Georgetown and St. Louis and other Jesuit institutions, other Catholic women religious involved in remembering our histories of inhumanity in our Catholic institutions, especially with respect to enslaved people, but also with respect to indigenous people and people who had been racialized within U.S. history. And so that importance of the dangerous memory, right? The ways in which we willfully forget some things because they're difficult to embrace and to try to live our way through and to repair. And so I think that dimension of memory, being able to gather with people who are committed to being part of this long tradition, and that the memory of those who have been written out of the tradition is also part of what we're doing.
Yeah. As you all shared, I also thought about there's so many ways of like looking at the legacy of Ignatius himself and seeing that he's not alone, of course, but he saw things in terms of how memory should work. And one of the things is that I can't forget the bad. And of course, relate to it in a proper way, right? That it's not like, especially that first week of the spiritual exercises, the point is not, although the text could seem to just suggest otherwise, that the point is not to like make us feel totally as if we're totally just lost, but it is to be like, I need to remember the bad as well as the good, but then find God in those details. And that means like pressing on is not just this happy-go-lucky, but very much like we're part of these histories. It's real. There's responsibility, and that there's actually freedom in being like, that was part of being American. That was part of being Catholic. That's part of being in the Jesuit institution. And it's heartening too that there are folks, individuals, entities, right? Particularly, I think Maryland, at least in the East Province, has been very, very focused on this, and it's so necessary. And back to like that, these histories are significant. I couldn't help but imagine that if I were a college student and I was like kind of tapped to read the names or hold a candle that in the moment it would be like, what am I doing? Why do I have to do this? Or a high school student, because there were high school students too, but that down the road that might light up in their memory and be like, oh, yeah, God was telling me something important.
Mhm.
Yeah. And so for that reason too, for our listeners, it's good for you to hear that, for us, this was only my second teach-in, but we've got lots of fresh history and lots of, longue durée history, as a historian would say, and that all of that's important. I want to take another tack. And so, one of the interesting things about Ignatian and Jesuit world work is that it's mission-minded, and it's often explicitly mission-minded, right? We're drawing on prayer. We're drawing on our relationship with God, with Jesus, and so on. And yet it's also flexible enough that it can invite people to find meaning and actualize themselves spiritually, even if it's not God as a thematic, and even if they're not teaching religion or theology. And so what are some of the ways that you would invite folks to encounter the Ignatian tradition and translate it? I think that's really helpful because, yes, you will have, religion teachers at Xavier High School, but we've got VP of Communications. And Jeannine, you're working with all sorts of faculty as well as students across a range of, commitments and so on. And so there's a great opportunity here to model that this is a malleable and very practical tradition. So what comes to mind?
I can speak to that a bit. I think for me, the heart of what I do is I tell stories. And in almost every way that we tell stories in my office, we try to communicate how our students, how our alumni, how our faculty and staff live the mission to go forth and transform the world for God's greater glory. And I think there is tremendous opportunity in that to translate, as you said, the Ignatian tradition into ways that people can understand. How can someone who works in medicine do that? How can a student who's just presented at the teach-in do that? We all have our way to do it. And I think the challenge of that, especially now, is how do we make sure that these stories are transmitting to all of our constituencies? And I'm going to kind of take your words back home with me, that idea of translating the Ignatian tradition. I think that's something else that's great for me to keep in mind, and for my colleagues to keep in mind as well. Love it.
Yeah, thank you.
So the practice that comes to mind for me is the simple carving out time for discernment. And I think that when I find students, so not doing it thematically that we're going to study Ignatian discernment, but rather that the classroom is a place, the campus is a place, our relationships are places to invite people to put away, right, the things that distract us, and to just carve out that time to listen to those waves of discernment. And in a sense, it's such a simple idea and it's such a universal idea. But I've spoken with both my own children and the young people that I work with at the university, just this sense that to make a decision about who one wants to be in the world, you don't have to run out and try all these things. You need to carve out the time to listen deeply. And so without the thematic, right? Without saying, oh, this is Ignatian and now it's discernment. It's well, let's just do some of this. Let's just carve out that time because that's when the work of the divine happens.
Yeah.
Mine is similar, I think, to what you were saying just about that space and the phrase contemplatives and action, having, sort of directed a program where that was the source, not really ever thinking about, oh, does that just mean that we're, doing stuff, and we had someone come, Chris Derby, Jesuit brother Chris Derby, came to Xavier last year, maybe, or the year before, and offered us a day of prayer. And he was talking about, Jesuit Father Nadal, for whom, sort of that's where this comes from. And Brother Derby said, back up and say, let us be contemplative in our action as we are contemplative in our prayer. Mm. And I thought, that's what that meant, right?
Yeah.
And to say, in my workplace, and certainly mine is riddled with God, just by definition of what I do. But I think in so many spaces to say, yes, it's not prayer over here and my life over here, but in the way that I act in the world, am I intentional? Am I thinking, how come I'm doing it, right? What is driving me? What is, sort of the peace that I seek or the thing that I seek as a result? And so I love that idea of being contemplative in our action, not just, sort of running around and being thoughtful, but to be rooted in that contemplation and taking time to pause and not just be sort of fully moving forward at a constant clip.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. One of the things that came to mind in listening to all of you is both in high school and in college, the decisions are actually really profound and are really rich for unpacking what discernment is. Like I got goosebumps thinking about when I decided to major in theology, that actually was a big decision. And I felt it in the moment, and I felt the even anguish. And it's weird. It's like there's anguish over what are you choosing as a major? and as I look back, there's actually similar decisions even in high school. And so it's like really to be a contemplative in action, to lead others to be a contemplative in action. It's like you're really on the, I was tempted to use the military term, the battleground, but at the forefront, at the edge, right on the street. Yeah. And so it's really rich. That might have sparked some ideas, thoughts, memories. So please feel free to just hop right in. Yeah. And it's okay if not, but yeah.
Well, it's not quite memories, but thoughts. Part of the work that I do in teaching Intro to Theology, I bring students to different locations around New York City to experience the way different communities pray and they contemplate, et cetera. And almost every time I brought this one group into a new sacred space, they would just say, "This is so peaceful." And then we'd go to another sacred space, completely different, and they would say, "This is so peaceful." It was almost as if the remainder of their lives was so full of other things, right? That the invitation just to clear space for the divine to enter was profound, right? And so it is both, right, the discernment, clearing space for discernment, but even just clearing space to be present to all that's going on. Yeah. Like that is an old tradition, but I think it is so, the young people that I work with authentically articulate that they desire this quiet, this space.
Yeah, we brought back our silent retreat for seniors this past year. And
for high schoolers.
For high schoolers.
Oh.
That's a lot of silence. That's so hard.
Yeah.
But just 2 nights, 3 days. And no phones, very little of us doing too much direction. And it seemed, kind of watching them the whole time, just kind of seeing how things were going. And, we celebrated Mass at the end and asked the boys, to kind of talk to each other finally about how it went, because they had even chosen to do silence at meals. We had given them the option. We said, maybe one meal you can use for conversation. They were like, no, we're going to, do the silence. And one of the boys who was super thoughtful, but he was like, Miss DeWitt, I don't want you to think that I'm being critical. And he said, but I don't think that I have ever been bored before. And he said, there has not been a time when I was with myself and didn't have something happening that I wouldn't immediately pick up my phone or go to listen to something or go to watch something. And he said, and it was so hard to be bored, and he said, but I was so happy once I got over the difficulty of that silence. And so when I asked, would you suggest other students do this? And they were like, 100%, it was so hard, but it was so good, because they don't have the silence. It's just simply not there. And it's so easy to do anything else other than be in that space of peace. And so I think part of our job, certainly in higher ed and in secondary education, and certainly for younger kids, is to give them spaces because it's hard for them to decide to do that themselves, you know?
Yeah. There's and I won't name the theologian because two at this table will know who I'm thinking of, and it's going to lead to laughter and stuff. But there's a sense that part of discernment is you notice, but then you notice that you notice, right? And what's happening in that noticing. And part of why I lift that up is I think too, there's an opportunity and a reality that in the context you're in, that you actually get to see how each generation has a window into what discernment looks like. And so even like to be able to name that I've never been bored before is really important data for how to get people into discernment, what to look for and how to respond to it. And so are there other things about today's high school student or college student that you would lift up and say, actually, they do know something really important about discernment, about prayer, about being bothered about pressing on, so on and so forth. It could be a practice, it could be a habit, it could be really silly even, but I think it's really important to capture this as best as possible.
I mean, I think our students are perhaps maybe a lot more aware of injustices just by virtue of having access to them being presented to them, kind of 24 hours a day. And I feel like that we're trying to transition from the world is hard and there are a lot of terrible things to what can you do? And the Teach-in is one of those places that I find so extraordinary as an option to say, yeah, we just spent 2 days hearing about some really hard stuff. But guess what? Tomorrow we get to say, to my staffer at my senator's office, this is what we want. We're young. We might not even be old enough to vote, but these are the things that we want to do to be able to transform not only our community, but our world. And I think that frustration period in between for our students, I think has gotten really short. So I think as opposed to, there's this trajectory of, yes, something's wrong. I have no idea, right? Where our students are like, I see something's wrong. What are we doing? Right. And how are we going to make sure everybody knows that we're doing something in particular? So I found that with, not so mumuch apathy with our young people now, but like seriousness that is like, you'll listen to me, right? Because I might not be an adult. I might not have the education that the other people who are talking about it might have, but they're willing to feel that and then to want to do something as a result.
Yeah.
I think that the students that I encounter now in comparison to maybe 25 years ago or so do seem to have a greater sense of the affirmation of diversity, that my classroom is a religiously diverse, a racially diverse, an ethnically diverse classroom, and the expectation that we're going to learn from each other, that we're going to be bringing different experiences. I may just happen to have gotten a particularly good group of students, but it just seems like they are coming into the classroom with that orientation. And that the Jesuit system for me was the place when I was growing up in Chicago. I grew up in a white suburb, but my high school experience in a Jesuit institution was very racially and ethnically diverse. But that doesn't necessarily translate everywhere, but that in the system that I've been teaching in, I can see the way in which that diversity is really celebrated.
Yeah.
What I've noticed and been so impressed by recently is how well our students at Xavier engage with those with whom they disagree. And I think that's something that they have had to develop because of the tenor of the division in our country. And I was so impressed just about an hour ago as 4 of our boys presented about our Holocaust Studies program, and not just what they had learned about the Holocaust and fighting anti-Semitism, but their responses to questions about how do you engage with people who maybe spouting conspiracy theories or say that what you believe is not true. And several of them responded that we have to talk to people. We have to be able to gently correct them. That idea of like the presupposition of goodwill, right?
Yeah.
Giving people the plus sign. And that wasn't the language they were using, talking about translating the Ignatian tradition.
Yeah.
They were saying, if you just fight back, people aren't going to hear you.
Right.
And that's something that I've noticed a lot of recently. And I'm very happy that I'm noticing it among our boys.
Yeah, that is amazing. And then that there's the language of hearing that I think is just so rich. The desire to hear. I mean, that's like vintage Ignatian. So that's so great. We're gonna have to wrap up soon. It's a frenetic Ignatian Family Teach-in for Justice. And so as we approach this final one, I want to go back just to the theme. So the theme is pressing on. And so in a nutshell, I'll throw kind of a variety of possibilities, but how does Ignatian spirituality help someone press on, or you personally press on? Maybe what does that look like? If there's also the idea of Ignatian spirituality is often about images. It's also about values, right? We have all these slogans and core values. So what's important in this tradition that helps us press on?
I think you'd mentioned the Brophy students talking about the examen, which is totally fantastic. For me, I think one of the things that is about the constant movement forward and that pressing on is praying the examen with some regularity, and that it is the touch point each day that says, am I listening, right? Am I paying attention? Do I see what's happening and where God is present to me? Or maybe those places where I fell short and the places where I could have done something differently, but always, sort of that final step of asking for what I need for what is next. And so that's important in these huge, bigger picture things, but it's also in, if I can get to Wednesday, right? Like, what do I need? What do I need to ask God for to move forward? And so I think for me, the examen in a very practical way is a thing that says, if it wasn't today, it can be tomorrow. And we'll just keep that movement forward.
Yeah, love it.
I appreciate that Kaija is naming the spiritual practices of prayer that frame an Ignatian tradition. And for me, the prayer for generosity is one that I just find in the pressing on, right? This need to come back and say, yes, this is hard, but what am I being asked to do? And how do I take myself and my ego out of the way and return with that fundamental prayer in the hopes that I'm doing what I'm being called to do.
Yeah.
I think for me, I go back to something that was a highlight of my retreat a few weeks ago. And something that helps me press on is that idea of patient trust. We spent some time with Tehard and I think that's something that I need to center myself in. Our students need to center ourselves in. There's a lot going on. There's a lot going on in the country and the world that can discourage us. But if we realize that, we're impatient of being on the way, right? But day by day, step by step, if we didn't do it today, as Kaija said, tomorrow we can achieve more. I think that's important to keep in mind.
Love it. This has been a really rich conversation. I thank all of our colleagues, 2 from Xavier, 1 from Fordham, all kind of New York City area, and all educators in the education field. So thanks for this great conversation.
Thanks, Dave.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dave.
Special thanks to our guests, Dr. Jeannine Hill-Fletcher, Professor of Theology at Fordham University, Kaija DeWitt-Allen, Director of Campus Ministry at Xavier High School, and Shawna Gallagher Vera, Vice President of Communications and Marketing, Xavier High School. To delve into Ignatian discernment a little bit more, visit discernment.ignatian.info. And to learn more about the Ignatian Family Teach-in for Justice, visit ignatiansolidarity.net. Thanks for listening. Wishing you grace today on your Ignatian way. Ignatian Pathways is hosted by me, Dr. Dave De La Fuente, and produced and presented by the Office of Ignatian Spirituality, a ministry of the USA East Province of the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits.